The next part of our story begins in the late 1960s with the return of Fu Manchu, who had not appeared on film in over 25 years, ever since the War Department had sent that memo out. However, a big return was made when Seven Arts Productions resumed making Fu Manchu movies starring Christopher Lee as Fu Manchu. Christopher Lee, alias Count Dooku and Saruman the White, and I think the best ever Dracula. Anyway, they made 5 of these movies in 5 years. Well, they don't keep making movies if someone's not going to watch them, right? So this was popular. Also, it was around this time that, the late 1960s, people were experimenting with hairstyles and grooming, and that's when people started calling a particular type of mustache a Fu Manchu mustache, by the way. So some of you, I hope, didn't think that the character Fu Manchu is named after the mustache instead of the other way around. Anyway, let us take a look at Roy Thomas, whom we have mentioned before. Roy Thomas, who started writing for Marvel in the 1960s and kind of gradually took over writing chores from Stan Lee on several books, including The Avengers. And in 1972, took over as editor-in-chief when Stan Lee left the comic book part of the business to go and be in charge of the movies and animation stuff out in Hollywood. Anyway, why are we bringing Roy Thomas into this? Remember, when we talked about him before, it was when we were discussing the Golden Age, even though he was just a little kid then, because he's sort of brought back a lot of Golden Age stuff in the 1970s. He was very enamored of the pulp fiction era and the golden age of comics, all the stuff that was popular when he had been a kid. So, in 1970, he had talked Stan Lee into paying good money, to license the obscure character Conan the Barbarian and put him in comic books. He had started in the pages of The Avengers, where he was the writer, bringing back a bunch of the old Golden Age heroes like the Wizard and Miss America. And then he would put together a whole new team set in World War II called the Invaders. Point is, he likes that old stuff. And all of a sudden, Fu Manchu's making a comeback. And he also encouraged Stan Lee to urge the company to make the effort to buy the rights to Sax Rohmer's, or to license, not to buy outright, to license the rights to Sax Rohmer's characters so they could make Fu Manchu comic books, right? Because the character is becoming popular again. Even though, not just in 1940, but as far back as 1932, one of the Fu Manchu movies was protested by the Chinese government for how offensive and racist it was. Anyway, it was the 70s. So they're negotiating to get the rights to Fu Manchu, which Marvel successfully does. Okay, here's another thread to the story. Remember just a little while ago we were talking about blaxploitation movies, and I mentioned that kung fu movies from Hong Kong became all the rage at around the same time. Well, in 1972, there was a new TV show called Kung Fu, which was a huge hit, starring David Carradine. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the show, if it was before your time, it was a Western. It was about a Buddhist monk, Kung Fu expert who's wandering the American West. So that was huge. 1973, Enter the Dragon, starring Bruce Lee, came out and was a huge, huge hit. It was the third Bruce Lee movie to be released to American audiences made in Hong Kong. By the way, Bruce Lee has said, and there's evidence, I think, to back this up, that the Kung Fu TV show was his idea. He had actually talked about it on a talk show, an idea he was pitching for a kung fu expert in the Old West. And they went ahead and Warner Brothers went ahead and made this TV show. And not only did they not give him credit, they were initially going to ask him to star in it, which would have been ideal. But then they decided Bruce Lee looks too Chinese. American audiences won't identify with him. So they didn't want a Chinese person playing a Chinese person. So they got David Carradine, who is not Chinese. He's just a white guy, to play the Chinese person. Anyway, all that's beside the point. Bruce Lee, a huge, huge sensation. And in July 1973, when this movie was at the peak of its popularity, he died tragically of a heart attack. And that made him even more popular. Wildly, wildly popular. Him and Kung Fu in general. This new trend, right? Now, Roy Thomas had already, in 1972, given the green light for a blaxploitation superhero, right? Luke Cage. So at this point, Roy Thomas is trying to get the rights, the licensing rights for the TV show Kung Fu, because it's so popular. But Marvel doesn't get it. They don't get the deal. You know why? Because Kung Fu, the TV show, is made by Warner Brothers. Remember who owns DC Comics at this time and still does? No. Yeah, they still do. Warner Brothers. So DC got the rights to the TV show and then never did anything with it. So, bam, they missed out on that opportunity. And then an idea came together between Roy Thomas, who was trying to juggle all these things, and a couple of freelancers working for Marvel. The writer Steve Englehart and the artist Jim Starlin, who on their way, I think the story is they had gone and seen a Kung Fu movie together, and they were talking about what a cool comic book that would make. And so it was decided, we can't get the Kung Fu TV show. Let's make our own Kung Fu hero. We really can't license Bruce Lee. Actually, they probably couldn't afford to, even if it were something that were possible. So let's get a Kung Fu character a lot like Bruce Lee. And since we've already got all these Sax Rohmer characters, let's bring Fu Manchu into it. In fact, the book that came out as a result of this, it was tried out in special Marvel edition and then it became its own book, was originally going to be called Fu Manchu. But they settled on Master of Kung Fu. The said Master of Kung Fu being the Chinese character Shang, which would, I guess, more appropriately be pronounced Shang-Chi, who is a master of Kung Fu, who also just happens to be the son of the villainous, insidious, and evil Fu Manchu. Except he's a good guy, and he's opposed to his father's criminal empire, and he winds up opposing his father and getting involved with his father's arch enemy, Sir Dennis Nayland Smith, who was his arch enemy for ever since like 19 teens in the old books. And he becomes basically a secret agent for the British MI6. And it goes from being a Kung Fu action series to also being a James Bond-like spy series. And it was pretty popular. It was popular enough. It lasted from 1973 until 1983, I want to say. I think it was 1983. So 10 years, when a lot of other books came and went, when a lot of books that were riding that trend of Kung Fu stuff fell by the wayside. And a part of the reason is because it was so well done. These guys created the character, but they left after a few issues, and Doug Minch was the writer for the rest. He's the one that brought the whole spy element into it. But another reason that it lasted was because it wasn't one of the best sellers. It wasn't one of Marvel's best sellers, so they didn't print a whole lot of copies. Now, the way things worked was they would post date these comic books, right? So they would actually really come out in February and be dated April or May, so that it would give them 2 or 3 months on the shelf so they could be sold. If they weren't sold in a certain time, and this is still how it works with magazines, they would rip the covers off so that no one could resell them, and ship them back to the publisher, and the retailers would get their money back, right? So if all the copies of a book don't sell, the publisher has to take back the copies they sent out. They have to eat that. So books that were more successful than Master of Kung Fu, therefore had a higher circulation number. More copies of the more popular books were printed. And if they didn't all sell, Marvel lost some money. They didn't print a whole lot of copies of this, and all of them usually sold. So it was actually more profitable than some of the more popular books. And so it kind of hung in there for a while. That's all kind of like, how the hot dogs are made kind of stuff. But anyway, point is, Shang-Chi lasted in his own title for a long time, well past the passing of the Kung Fu fad. And then, after just a few years off the scene in the 1990s, came back and has continued to be around in the Marvel Universe. Sometimes, he was a member of the Avengers for a while. Changed his look, a more modern and less stereotyped look. And you may be aware of this. Of course, I'm recording this for my class in the summer of 2020. I don't know if it may be seen again by someone else, but as of this recording, summer of 2020, Marvel's one of their next movies, scheduled to come up, if any movies ever come out again, after the COVID-19, is Shang-Chi, the Legend of the Ten Rings, in which Shang-Chi is going to be played by the Chinese-American actor Simu Liu. And not only is much of the cast going to be Asian, but the director and the writer are Asian as well. And that brings us to this guy, Bill Wu, who was one of, and probably the most influential Asian American when it came to Asian representation in comic books in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, Bill Wu is a famous author. He is an American Studies professor. He's a science fiction writer. He has won a lot of science fiction and fantasy awards. And he's even, as you can see in the picture here, he's even written Star Wars novels and episodes of the newer version of The Twilight Zone. But that's not why we're talking about him. That's not why we're talking about him. Because in the 1970s, he was not any of those things. In the 1970s, he was a grad student. He was a grad student at the University of Michigan, I believe, in the American Studies department. Where he was doing his dissertation on American pop culture representations of Chinese people. And he also happened to love comic books, and he read a lot of comic books, and he was also very, like a lot of grad students, very outspoken. And he wrote frequently to the letters pages of various comics from Marvel and DC and the other publishers. His letters would show up fairly regularly in Richard Dragon Kung Fu Fighter over in DC, and Karate Kid in DC. Deadly Hands of Kung Fu from Marvel, which was a black and white magazine where the Daughters of the Dragon appeared, and Iron Fist, and even some of the lesser known kung fu comics from Charlton and other companies, but the biggest influence came from his letters to Master of Kung Fu. And remember, Doug Minch was the writer for the series after for most of its run after the first few issues. So these letters Bill Wu was sending in were being responded to by Doug Minch, and it became an ongoing conversation. Now, here's just one sample of a letter. Dear Bullpen, that's the Marvel Bullpen, which is kind of like a nickname for the group. I have a question dealing with responsibility. As a company which puts all its credits on the printed page, perhaps you would explain some of the decision making involved. Am I leading up to a pointed question? Oh yes, and here it is. Which of the illustrious names on your title page determined the Shadow Stalker would be the same hue as an overripe banana? Naturally, this question is important to me, or I wouldn't have written, but beyond that, I suspect that many readers would like to know more about the development of such details in a general sense. How about it? So he kept harping on this subject. Why do you keep coloring Asian characters these weird shades of yellow and orange? Because, you know what? People aren't actually yellow or orange. And that is actually a racist stereotype. And he pointed out a lot of other stereotypes that crept in to this comic and other comics. And some of the other writers and editors, quite honestly, couldn't stand him. They would get all bent out of shape about his questions and get very defensive. And so did Doug Minch to an extent. He started off being defensive. About not only this issue, but also the very fact they were using Fu Manchu, who already by the 1970s was famous as being one of the most racist stereotypes of Asians ever in all time. And what you saw unfolding issue by issue as they're having this conversation, and it spilled over. They started having conversations. Well, at one point, Bill Wu couldn't write in because he was in China visiting, and so he tape recorded a letter and mailed it to Doug Minch's house, I guess, and his home address. But anyway, what happened over time is that as a result of this, Doug Minch came around and came to admit that Bill Wu's claims and his complaints were valid, and that he was right. And so Minch then started making those same complaints to the editors, the editorial editors, not just of the magazine, but the editorial offices. And this led to, among other things, Marvel no longer coloring Asian characters yellow and orange and so forth, but actually making them a more human-looking shade like all the other people that were in the comic. And that was the biggest change, but there were a lot of other changes too that Minch made, in which he kind of changed his way of looking at things as a result of interacting with Bill Wu. So that's the power of a determined fan right there.
Everybody was kung fu fighting. Those kids were fast as lightning.
Yes, everybody was kung fu fighting because it was the 70s. Even the ladies. The main difference being that they weren't doing it in their own book. They were doing it as supporting characters, and most often as part of a group or part of a team, like in Richard Dragon Kung Fu Fighter that I mentioned before. You had Lady Shiva, a former assassin who became an ally of Richard Dragon and his African-American partner, Ben Turner, so they were like a trio of kung fu crime fighters. And virtually the same situation and virtually the same storyline, really, in Marvel at that time with the Sons of the Tiger over in Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. You had Sons of the Tiger, a white guy, a black guy, and a Chinese guy. They were joined by an Asian woman, and we never find out exactly what ethnicity she is. That's another thing. In some of these books, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, what's the difference? Essentially, is how they approached it. Anyway, so she joins as like the fourth member of their team. Leiko Wu is the love interest of Shang-Chi, so she's part of his supporting cast, and she's also part of the team of MI6 secret agent spies. And then, of course, Colleen Wing, that we've mentioned before, who comes a little bit closer to some autonomy than the others, even though she and Misty Knight started off as Iron Fist supporting characters. They, as a duo, had that backup feature in Deadly Hands of Kung Fu in the 70s, but unfortunately it only lasted a few issues because the book got canceled, and it would be 30 years before they would have their own title. But it was still part of a duo, right? It wasn't one book about an African American lady and one about an Asian American hero. It was the both of them together, and that's kind of a theme. Remember when I forgot to point that out when we were looking at those Indian superheroes at Marvel and DC. If you go back and look at that, almost every one of them was part of a team, especially among the women. In fact, I think all of the women, yes, all four of the women, which are four of the six Indian characters, were part of a team. So they didn't carry the story themselves. That phenomenon, by the way, was not confined to merely martial arts female heroes. Female superheroes who happened to be Asian that were introduced in the 70s and 80s into the early 90s tended to have the same thing happen. They were part of a team, So, in other words, whenever there is an Asian or an Asian American woman, that is something that is added on. It's not something that, not someone who is carrying the book. And unfortunately, that hasn't changed a whole lot even since then. All right. Well, since the turn of the new century, in the 21st century, there has been a huge growth of Asian characters and Asian American characters, and it would be difficult to list them all. It's kind of the same thing that happened, when we're talking about African Americans, when we're talking about women superheroes. It's like you can easily list the ones from the various eras until you get past the 1990s, and then it just sort of mushrooms exponentially, and that is a great thing. Although, as we'll see later on with the Comics Gate discussion that's coming up down the road, not everyone thought so. So it would be a very time-consuming thing to try to list all of those characters that have come about since 2000. And I haven't even tried to list all the ones from before, just some of them. But one in particular that I do want to mention is this young man, this young Korean American named Amadeus Cho, who was introduced as a super genius who happened to be sidekick to the Incredible Hulk. First appeared in 2005. 19 years old at the time of his introduction. He also, after his, kind of like Rick Jones, he kind of like went through a couple of sidekick phases. He became also the sidekick of Hercules, but eventually came into his own when he himself was gamma irradiated with the powers to become the Hulk in 2015. So when that happened, It was no longer the Incredible Hulk, it was the Totally Awesome Hulk as the title. And as of 2020, Amadeus Cho is still big and green when he wants to be. In 1998, Marvel even introduced an all-Asian superhero team, Big Hero 6, led by Sunfire, who, along with the Silver Samurai, had been a part of the Marvel Universe since the early 70s, and some new characters. So this is supposed to be the premier super team of Japan. And many years later, about like 15 years later, there was a Disney movie that was very, very loosely based on this comic and this team. Still, that's pretty significant, right? An all Japanese superhero team. Not to be outdone, DC came up with their own all Chinese super team called the Great 10. So, yeah, you got 6 Japanese people. We'll just have 10 Chinese people. That'll show you. All of them new characters. And at this point, I suppose, Marvel could have pointed out to DC, well, if you want to talk about Chinese superheroes, we had one way back in 1980 who was just one guy that was actually 5 guys. So our one guy is almost, he's half as much as what you've got. They could have done that, but I guess they didn't. Anyway, more recently, in 2019, Agents of Atlas has been relaunched. When it first came out 20 years before that as a concept, it was all the 1950s Atlas heroes led by Jimmy Woo. In this new incarnation, this new imagining of it, it is an all-Asian team with Jimmy Woo right there front and center, Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu, down in the lower right-hand corner. You have Quake over in the left-hand corner. Quake you might recognize if you've been watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for the last 7 years. Amadeus Cho, who's no longer the Totally Awesome Hulk and is now known as Brawn, but he's still green and he's still pretty big, just not as big. Silk, who's there hanging upside down. She's kind of like got powers like Spider-Man, and several others. So at the very least, we've got several all-Asian teams in the Marvel and DC universes alone, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There has been, like I said, a mushrooming of Asian and Asian American and other minority characters in the last 20 years or so.